Vážení hosté, kolegyně a kolegové, nyní mám tu čest vyzvat pana profesora Konstantina Sigova, našeho dnešního laureáta, aby pronesl přednášku na téma The Question of Truth on the Threshold of a New Europe. Pane profesore, ujměte se místa. Myslím, že rozumí česky, tak nemusím překládat. Do ukrajinštiny bych to nezvládl.
Ladies and gentlemen, dámy a pánové, dovolte mi, abych vám, že všeho nejdříve poděkoval za vaši pohostinnost. Poskytujete mi je dnes tak, jako jste poskytli tolika mi krajanům. The high honor of your learned society inscribed your act of the hospitality in the concentrated form into overall history of Europe. Vaclav Havel noted the striving of totalitarian regimes toward the destruction of history as such. It was called Kleocide, the act of killing history, by Sergei Krymsky, my teacher and the advisor of my doctoral thesis in the Kievan School of Philosophy at the moment of the collapse of the USSR. The restoration of the historical connections between Prague and Kyiv reminds us of the names and the colorful pages of our common annals. In 1921, soon after the Bolshevik army overthrew the government of the independent Ukraine, Dmytro Czyżewski, a famous cultural historian, left Kyiv for Prague. Working at the Ukrainian Free University in Prague, as well as in Germany, Halle, Czyżewski found and published the lost manuscript of the Opus Magnum, major work of Jan Amos Kamensky. In his work, The Labyrinth of the World of the Kamensky, Themes and Sources, 1953, Czyżewski articulates both the Ukrainian response to the hospitality of Prague culture and his warning against the Bolshevik attempt at Kleocide, the disruption of historical memory. Professor Lenka Karsikova translated my book into Czech, and it was recently published in Prague. The title is Poselství z Kyjeva. In it, as in my other two books, published in French in Paris, I developed Czyżewski's ideas which are dear to me in the context of the present war in Europe. I will list a key points. On April 27th, 2023, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of the EU recognized the deportation and forcible relocation of Ukrainian children to the territory of the Russian Federation as genocide. The deportation of children before our eyes represents the most radical break with the traditional practice of hospitality. Ancient as mankind itself, Immanuel Kant saw the rule of the hospitality as the very basis of the human legality. The crimes against humanity that are being committed today by the Russian Federation are a total violation of legality. Month after month, the destruction by the aggressor rockets of high-rise civic buildings and the murder of children, women, men, and old people enter our consciousness and stand before our eyes. The total destruction of living quarters and the whole towns in Ukraine multiplies the crimes of Putin's regime, which had begun in Chechnya, in Georgia, and in Syria. This is not a nightmare from which we can awaken tomorrow. This is the nihilistic matrix of a criminal regime transformed into a system. Along with the letter Z, the characteristic sign has become an apartment building split open by the rocket. Why? Are we expected to get used to that? This is our history, and a debilitating history. No one can erase it now. In my eyes, the image of an annihilated house leads us to the question of the foundation of Putin's lawlessness, which cannot be seen on television screens. The question of his impunity in his bunker and at the end of his historical term. Free people challenge the every basis of foundation of the impunity of the Soviet crimes, the impunity on which Stalin regime was built. The collapse of the foundation shakes Putin's regime entirely and the deep bunker of his fear. The Kremlin people are trying to persuade themselves that it is not the end yet, and they fire rockets at our houses. Fragile houses in which people had been living with a chance for humanity in every window. The key image of Stalin's regime was described by Vasily Grossman, a Jew from Ukraine, the first author of important books in Russian about the Soviet totalitarian system. The Kremlin tried to destroy his texts, to erase his testimony. Grossman's books were forbidden to be published in the USSR. After Stalin's death in 1953, Grossman wrote the first book about the Holodomor in 1933 in Ukraine. Everything flows. Grossman reminds us the foundation of the totalitarian state without freedom and had been laid by Lenin and Stalin. The whole of Stalin's architecture was defined by violence instead of justice and rights, by terror instead of law. Bolshevik terror cleared the building site at the Soviet state, sweeping away residential buildings, houses, and the edifices of old regime. The Cheka terror dug a pit for the foundation of Stalin high-rise buildings and defined its design. The KGB terror hid behind the facade of Soviet state when the finished edifice was put into operation. The facade was hung with defeatful slogans and ephemeral portraits of leaders. And the facade itself was the endless propaganda lies led by the most deceitful newspaper of 20th century, called Pravda. The reading of Orwell's book, 1984, today should be complemented by the parallel reading of Everything Flows. Grossman leads us to the historical question. The high-rise building is peopled by new tenants. Of course, there is a lot that is unfinished, but there is no need to go on using the destructive methods of the great builder, the old master. The foundation of the building on freedom still holds. What will happen next? Is this foundation so unshakable? End of quotation. Is this foundation so unshakable? I underline this question and I answer it in the negative, together with Grossman, who said, no matter how enormous the building and powerful the cannons, no matter how boundless the state power and powerful of empires, all that is merely smoke and fog, which will vanish. What remains developed and lives in the only true power, the one thing which is freedom. For man to live means to be free. Not all reality is reasonable. Everything that is inhuman is senseless and useless. The Kremlin voted that Grossman's book would not be published in his country in the next 200 years. Nevertheless, the forbidden book, Everything Flows, was published in the USSR in 1989. The Kremlin is not capable of any historical guarantees. Its attempts to control history are in vain. Its present-day master is doomed. The order for Vladimir Putin's arrest, issued by International Criminal Court in The Hague on March 17, 2023, makes irreversible the most essential demand of law and justice. The call for law had been insisted upon from the very beginning by the citizens of Ukraine, by journalists from all over the world, jurists, experts, and other witnesses of Putin's crimes. The distinctive feature of this war and the main request of Ukrainian resistance is the leitmotif of law. The digital documentation of every day of this war distinguishes it from all previous conflicts in Europe. The openness of all the data to the process of justice and unprecedented abundance of documented testimonies and the existential will toward truth are the essential meaning of our history. What were the landmark events that led onto the path of the present state of affairs? The signing by the USSR and the free countries of the agreements in Helsinki in 1977 changed the whole and the role of criteria of human rights in assessing the states which did not respect the law. In Prague, the authors of Charter 77 and the Helsinki Group in Kyiv became islands of the new archipelago of the future other Europe. The philosopher Jan Patočka in Prague and the poet Vasil Stus in Kyiv paid the high price of their lives for the new meaning of two words, human rights. Those who trivialize the meaning of these words forget about this prize or are afraid of its memory. But what would the history of our dark time turn into without the memory of these people and the meanings that are illuminated by these names? Vaclav Havel understood it well when he spoke about democracy as a political form which would enable human beings to personally define their freedom as responsibility, deriving it from the nation that there exist things worth suffering for. In 1991, the hope of freeing themselves from the fear and oppression of the Soviet regime became the leitmotif of the independence of Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet republics at the moment of the dissolution of the USSR. But overcoming the Soviet inertia of intimidation called for great effort. In his book about the decline and fall of the Soviet Union, David Sutter reminds us, when the first demonstration began, parents begged their children not to take part in them. You'll be shot. Just as our brothers and sisters once were shot. But seeing such mass support of people striving for independence, people were getting rid of fear. After 1989, a public system of the truth about Stalin repression, about the Gulag and Holodomor became a criterion of freedom of the mass media, a criterion of the quality of cultural politics and programs of education in schools and universities. The strategy of glasnost from the first publication of the names of the executors and victims led to the end demand of fully open archives of the KGB for historical research. The development of the strategy of glasnost as an historical task, not only as a slogan of a local political campaign, has remained pertinent for us throughout the whole course of the last 30 years. In terms of the history of the development of public consciousness in Ukraine and in Russia after 1991, I distinguish two basic anthropological motifs: freedom from fear of violence and the right to tell the truth. It is hard to describe the countless obstacles on the path of this realization. To analyze them on one need not a short presentation, but a work in many volumes by experts on the question of justice and international law, culture and politics, economics and ethics, and the history of relations between church and state considers in the broad context, going far beyond the framework of the opposition, we, they. The priority of the question of law is connected with the retrospective insight into the fallacy of the politics that made a capstone of economic transition from Soviet socialism to savage capitalism. It is impossible for Western people to imagine how radically the communist ideology up to its collapse had been eradicated legal consciousness. There is an essential difference between those parts of the USSR where the communist regime took power in 1917 and the other part that were taken over 22 years later. These 2 decades mark the experience of generation of citizens in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Western Ukraine conquered by the Soviet army in 1939, after the agreement between Stalin and Hitler, sealed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The differences of the structure of historical memory were further consolidated by the experience of many Baltic people and Ukrainians in the Soviet camps, in the solidarity of the dissidents and the Helsinki group in the 1970s and 1980s. In the 1990s, the leader of Memorial pointed to particular problems of the rights of inherence in the great part of the Soviet territory, where people had been deprived of the rights of property after Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. The KGB managed to grab everything. It began during the latter part of Yeltsin term and under Putin. Instead of the bandit freedom of the oligarchs, a pyramid of Stalin type of power quickly emerged, governed by the former KGB generals. François Thoma, analyzing the Western failure to understand that Putin's ideas are not connected to any conviction, writes, "It is a great mistake for the West to think that this is regime defense, say, traditional values. That is to say, there is no understanding of precisely that Bolshevik notion that ideas are not a reflection of some convictions, but a weapon used to destroy the enemy." The philosopher Andrei Koyré described the totalitarian lie of the Stalins as having the logic of underground conspirators who got hold of government power. In the narrow circle of our guys, the scenario of the special operation and the set of marks is decided upon and demonstrated to the outside spectators, misguiding them by gestures of loyalty. In the post-Soviet period, the logic of agents and the special services supported the latest technologies, exceeded the scope of all previous propaganda. Its efficiency was underestimated for a long time, not only on the Western countries, but strangely enough, also in Ukraine. The erosion of criteria of truth and law undermines the credibility of any political whatsoever and the public sphere itself. On the eve of the war in Chechnya, the cult of brutal force and imperial militarism could not be raised alarms. Yet, this did not stop Ukraine from singing on December 5, in 1994, in Budapest, a memorandum on the renunciation of nuclear arms. The insufficient awareness of the danger of war which Russia continued in Ukraine after the second war in Chechnya and after the war Russia waged in Georgia in 2008. In 2004, following the Orange Revolution, many in Ukraine came to the hasty conclusion that people had got rid of their fears. More perspective contemporaries realized that the fears had not gone anywhere. It was just we had a temporary respite from being seriously intimidated. The tandem of Putin and Yanukovych made an attempt to revive intimidation. This attempt not only failed, but led to the opposite reaction. By the end of 2013, the event of Maidan in Ukraine confused the plans of anti-European politicians and astonished the Europeans. The peaceful revolution of dignity in Kyiv began under Ukrainian and European banners. Maidan became the place where people were not afraid to speak the truth and stand up for their rights. A vivid account of the Ukrainian revolution, a raw moment when the political became the existential, is given in the book of Marcy Shore, The Ukrainian Night, an intimate history of revolution, and in many texts of Timothy Snyder. We keep going back to the meaning of the events of Maidan, despite the war that Putin's regime began in the spring of 2014. After the annexation of Crimea, it is difficult to describe the historical dynamics of our society after Maidan with a simple formula. I define the meaning of our efforts after the revolution of dignity as the way from Homo Sovieticus to homo dignus. The understanding of this path is only the beginning of the process we have to go through. As Anne-Marie Pelletier observed, homo dignus is impervious to destroying vision which perceive the world on the basis of hostility to the other, on infinitive self-aggression, violence, and lies. The revolution of dignity became the decisive event in overcoming the Soviet habit of not taking into account human civil rights, to erasing human dignity, and Kyiv, at the historical moment, the blind curtain of a skillful and undefined view of man was turned down. The inertia of the 100 years of Soviet rule that alienated people from political life, in the deep meaning of this word, lost its influence. Having gone through the crucible of Maidan events, people came out as conscious citizens of Ukraine. No one of the Kremlin propaganda about the people of Maidan being anti-Semites or fascist could console the truth. The new universities of independent Ukraine, such as the State University Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, became laboratories for the systemic distinction between the Ukrainian on the one hand and the Soviet on the other. The students and teachers at these universities played a marked role in the revolution to the years 204 and 213, and above all, in the cultural and civic life between and after them. Vyacheslav Brukhovetsky, Miroslav Popovich, Sergei Krymsky, and other colleagues set high standards in the human sciences and definitely turned the page with stereotypes about the provincial and ethnographic character of Ukrainian culture. The signature project was the many volumes of Ukrainian translation of Dictionary of Untranslatable, Vocabulaire européen de philosophie, Dictionnaire des intraduisibles, published by Kievan publishing house Duch i Litera. In its language, hospitality was given to the richest concepts of ancient and European languages. In the article Pravda, for the original French edition, in this dictionary, I showed the essential inseparability of two meanings of this concept, truth and justice. The first code of Kievan laws of the 11th century was called Pravda. In this course of the 1,000 years of legal activity in Kyiv, the word Pravda played a key role. The Soviet regime tried for 70 years to break the systematic connection of the cognate words Pravda, Право, и справедливость, truth, law, and justice. But in this task, it suffered failure and broke down. Putin is trying to accomplish this task using the new technological resources of the 21st century. The main strategic task of these cyber attacks is directed at hacking the semantics of the word truth, pravda, to hack its meaning and supplant it with something uncognizable, such as mania of ring of power. He needs to manipulate truth as the key link of the whole chain of political ideas in order to achieve the total lobotomy of his people. This word is the drop in which the whole historical battle is reflected. Putin attempts to totally pervert the sense of Russian proverb, God is not in strength, but in truth, in pravda. Бог не в силе, а в правде. However, if we are to reduce Putin's role to one single word, this word will not be truth, pravda, but crime, преступление. zločin. And this crime on his will have an imminent punishment. The criminal vocabulary of Putin and his surrounding mafiosi determines the discourse of which Kremlin, the inhuman path of this discourse have been shaped by the century-long work of the Soviet torture chambers through which millions of tortured people went. Today, the torture chambers of the Russian Federation and in the occupied territories overfull the state norm of cruelty. The vocabulary of executioners and the slang of recidivists lend their tone to the speech of the Russian army, recorded in many phone conversations of the soldiers and officers available on the web. The unsustainability of this discourse on the other languages, it's impossible to translate it in your language and other languages, which lack the linguistic means shaped by a similar experience of cruelty, cannot be conveyed despite the efforts of the best European translators. Still, the material done, told, and critically treated by the jurists insufficient for the work of special international tribunal and for the qualified translation on criminal actions of the aggressor into the language of legal decisions. The question of pravda leads us today into the space of the new Europe. We, you and I, are all called in the face of the new challenges of history to rethink the sources of our courageous thinking of Patočka and Chizhevsky, Grossman and Orwell, Stoos and Havel. They laid out the way for the resistance to totalitarian as the perversion of absolute power. We will not be decided by the changes of the masks worn by absolute evil. Since February 24, 2022, we have been challenged by the absolute perversion of the crimes against humanity in Bucha and Mariupol, accompanied by proud videos showing the deportation of thousands of Ukrainian children by the Kremlin services. Today, the vocabulary of European resistance to evil passes in historical tasks on the battlefield of Ukraine. The necessary condition of a free future for all the countries of our continent is the reinforcement of our real solidarity aiming at the demilitarization of the aggressor. The historical experience of liberation can help us to find remedies for the sickness of our language and our intellectual habits. The quality of our future directly depends on the desovietization of our past and deputinization of our present. After Putin, a new historical space must be purified by the work of justice and scrutiny of all rooms of the state high-rise building, which after Stalin had not even been properly arrayed out. It is time to throw open all the windows and doors. You know, in Moscow, the sentencing to 25 years of the guiltless Vladimir Karamurza as an enemy of people leaves no illusions about the danger of delaying justice for his executioners. Putinism is the extreme form of state nihilism. The non-quite condemned evil seeks impunity and escape from justice. The worldwide wave of indignation over the pseudo-trial of Vladimir Karamurza raises the question of the fate and other political prisoners in Russia, the lion's share of whom are Ukrainians. The cost of delaying Ukraine integration into Europe is much higher than the cost of speeding up this process. The past craze about it in the voices of countless victims, and the present and the future wait for more solidarity and resolute steps towards unity. The post-imperial future of Russia and Europe depends on the real guarantees of security for Ukraine in the European family. At the end, let me quote that Bakhmut is the hometown of my teacher, the philosopher Sergei Krymsky. Today, the defense of Bakhmut is the battle against Cliocide, about the danger of which Krymsky and Havel reminds us. The condemnation of Putin's genocidal action in The Hague and Strasbourg is the legal front against Cliocide. Today, the war in Europe is fought not only in the fields of Ukraine, but in the space of meaning or meaninglessness. Resistance to absolute evil mobilized a special energy in people. Every day, my friends, students, colleagues in Ukraine testify the hope is not a theory, but an everyday practice. The other wing of this practice is your hospitality and solidarity, the pledge of freedom, yours and ours. Thank you again. Дякую многократно.